This is how you become a master of your craft. Hey folks, welcome back to Kubistar Music YouTube channel. My name is Yakub Saputra. I'm a composer and a jazz pianist. And today we are going to talk about the most important takeaways from a legendary must-read book, Effortless Mastery by Kenny Werner. It's probably the most recommended book for musicians. All musicians that I look up to, they always reference this book one way or another. And here I am to give you just a scratch of what it's all about. And we're going to do that in 3 parts. We're going to talk about, first, what prevents us from achieving mastery. Second, we're talking about what is mastery in the first place. And the third, we're going to talk about what do we need to do to achieve effortless mastery. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So let's start with what prevents us from achieving mastery. According to Kenny Werner in this book, the number one thing that prevents us from achieving mastery is fear. It's basically a fear that we are not good enough. But you might think for a second, where does this fear comes from? Well, in this book, Kenny Werner says that the fear comes from our little mind called ego, or what Kenny Werner describes as the I consciousness. This ego, this I consciousness creates separateness between I and the others, meaning there's you over there and there is I over here on the other side of the stage. And that's what perpetuates the sense of comparisons and competitions. And this is what leads us to make excuses for our own shortcoming. I'm not successful, not because of me, but because that person is just way more talented than I am. Or I just had a bad night, that's why I play like that. Or the industry just ain't fair. We basically blame everything else outside of our control and make them the reasons that we are not achieving what we're supposed to achieve, and we forget to look at the mirror. Page 53 right here probably is the most important page in this book. Come take a look. I almost make like a crazy bookmark right here just to make sure that I know where it is. But right here in this passage is probably the most important thing in this book as a whole. Let me read it for you. Taking an honest inventory of our musicianship is difficult. Some feel more comfortable condemning themselves totally than accurately assessing their strengths and weaknesses. They are usually defeated by a sense of futility before they play the first note. Others believe themselves to be better than they are, not wanting to face the gaps they need to work on. Their performances tend to hit or miss, but they rationalize that their best performances are how they really play, and their worst performances are just a flux. It's not really them. In this way, they avoid fixing and cleaning up what needs to be fixed and cleaned. In either case, the disclosures of flaws in their playing hurts. Because there is so much emotions attached to the flaws, the latter group will try to overlook them, and the former will use them as an evidence that they stink. Improvement is delayed 4 years, perhaps forever. You know what? The last sentence is the scariest one for me. Improvement is delayed 4 years or perhaps forever. Man, I don't want to delay my improvement forever. So in this book, Kenny Werner introduced us with 5 types of fears that prevents us from achieving mastery. They are fear-based playing, fear-based composing, fear-based practicing, fear-based listening, and fear-based teaching. Let's talk about the first 2, fear-based playing and fear-based composing. This is almost the same, so that's why I put them kind of together, because it's all about bringing out something, bringing out the creativity from the inside out. In this fear, we're basically afraid to play bad or write a bad music. We don't want to sound bad, and therefore we force the music out of us instead of letting the music or the arts to naturally come out of us. Because of this fear, we play or we write something that we're not ready yet, or that we're not supposed to play in the first place. For us jazz musicians, we tend to play something hip. It has to be hip, it has to be burned. Sometimes for no good reason at all, we think that it has to be fast. I have to play something fast right here, otherwise I'm gonna lose the audience. Even though most of the time, the music doesn't need to be that hip or burn, or it doesn't need to be fast at all. We are so afraid to play bad that we end up playing badly. It's quite ironic. The third kind of fear is the fear-based practicing. This is the root cause of fear-based playing because you can only play what you practice. If you're practicing based on fear, your playing will eventually stem from that same fear itself. So what does the fear-based practicing look like? First, it's marked by you jumping from one material to another material without ever finishing it. Either because you rush yourself through it or because you just lose interest in that material. It usually happens when you see somebody play some other cool stuff and some other hip sound and you feel the urge to be able to play that as soon as possible. Kenny Werner said, fear has ruined your practicing by rushing you through materials, making you unable to absorb anything. Second, your practicing session is always filled with anxiety and the feeling of overwhelm. Well, that's because you never allowed yourself to be good at one thing with one material. You are getting impatient. You want to be good now, not later, now. You always feel that there is not enough time to learn all the hippest things that you want to play. And lastly, when the feel of anxiety feels too overwhelmed, you will eventually fall victim into a vicious cycle of procrastination. You are so afraid to face the fact that there's a lot to learn that you just shut down entirely. Sounds familiar? All that things happens because you attach your self-worth to your music. The fourth type of fear is fear-based listening. Think about this. When you see a child prodigy or when your very talented musician's friend put out something on Spotify or whatever it is, what's the first thing that you feel? Do you feel excitement or do you feel tense in your body? Do you rush yourself to listen to that track or you kind of put it away, kind of avoiding it? Do you feel inspired after listening to it or do you feel a sudden awfulness about yourself? If you feel tense, if you avoid the music, or if you feel awful about yourself after listening to a good music, that means you are suffering from the fear-based listening. This is actually the most irrational of all, but you know what? I can totally relate to it too. This happens when we refuse to listen to good music because knowing that somebody can play that good, much better than us, makes us feel worthless. So instead of feeling inspired by the good music, our ego feels attacked. How twisted is that? Everything is about you, even when you listen to somebody else's work. This one pertains mostly to the many of us professional musicians who also a teacher. But it's also very important for music students to be aware of such teacher who by definition trapped in this fear of based teaching. Fear-based teaching is when a teacher is overloading their student with a preconceived knowledge, burying the students with paralyzing assignments, instead of nurturing the raw and unique potential that each students have. Fear-based teachers are by definition suffer from all of the above sphere. They have fear-based playing, fear-based composing, fear-based practicing, and fear-based listening themselves, mostly because they haven't worked out the meaning of reaching the mastery themselves. They usually are frustrated and have a self-loathing problem themselves. These fear-based teachers resent the talented students because the talented student threatens their own self-worth and they are secretly afraid and resent their student's gift. The bottom line is all of these fears are irrational and they all stem from the root of self-centeredness, ego, the I consciousness. And these fears are the things that prevents us from achieving mastery. The irony here is that the fear of not becoming great actually is the one that kept us from becoming great. Now, we knew what prevents us from becoming great. We knew that fear that comes from ego, from self-centeredness, is what keeping us away from achieving mastery. But now, how do we define mastery? What does it even mean to achieve effortless mastery? In this book, Kenny Werner defines mastery as playing whatever you're capable of playing every time without thinking. So these three things has to happen for you to say that somebody has achieved mastery. Playing whatever you're capable of playing. That means you don't have to be playing like Oscar Peterson and at the same time you're playing in the language of Coltrane and master all the genre in the world and master all the songs that ever composed. No, you don't have to do all that. You just need to master whatever you're deciding to essentially master. Kenny Werner adds, to be perceived as a master, you must stay within the boundaries of what comes naturally and easily. So in other words, to become a master, you need to find something, a technique, a genre or style of music that comes naturally and easily for you. And practice that until you can play it every single time beautifully without even thinking about it. If you can do that, you are a master. For Kenny Werner, the term effortless mastery is actually redundant because mastery is the effortless executions of music. I think this is what we often get confused because we see that there are so many ways and styles, so many hip techniques bombarding us left and right from the social media or from whatever. We feel like we have to be able to do all of them, and on top of that, it has to happen in the next 24 hours. How crazy is that? No wonder we feel so overwhelmed. And that's not what mastery is all about. So now we know what mastery is all about. And we know what prevents us from achieving mastery. So what do we do then to achieve mastery? Alright, P.S. This is when I use my own understanding of the book in presenting it to you. Because after all, this video is not a summary of the book, but rather it is my own personal takeaway from this book. Because in this book, Kenny Werner actually gives you about 4 steps to reprogram your relationship with music and your instrument specifically, which you should definitely try it out for your own good. But personally, I see all these 4 steps boil down into just 2 things, which is to practice and to play from the space and to have patience. I know it's a little bit cryptic, but bear with me for a second. The space. In this book, Kenny Werner will introduce us with the concept of space. It might not be a new concept for an artist because we all know and we all have experienced the space at some point in our artistic career. It is when we are performing or doing whatever it is that we're doing, performing, singing, composing, whatever it is, but you're doing it in absolute relaxed concentrations. We are in the zone. That's what we usually call it. But Kenny Werner describes the space a little bit further. He says something like this: when you are in the space, you will experience great compassion, great love, and great attachment. I know it starts sounding hippie and new agey, but again, bear with me for a second here. Because I think this is very on point because we need this great compassion and we need this great love to love and kind of to forgive ourselves for simply being the way we are. To forgive ourselves for not being able to do what we wish or what we fantasize we should have been able to do. Because if you remember in the beginning, fear that comes from ego is the root of the problem. It's what preventing us from becoming great in the first place. So this pace of compassion and love is the antidote for fear. What about the detachment part? What is it all about? When we are in the space, our music stops defining our self-worth. We actually stop thinking about what other people think about our performance. We stop worrying about how good or how bad we sound at that moment. And that's when we play our best, don't we? Detachment is what we experience when we are in the space, but it's also the thing that will get us there. In order to get into the space, in order to establish and performing from the space, we need to detach our self-worth from our music. Kenny Werner says, you must surrender the need to sound good in order to get into the space. That's why sometimes when we are playing, when we are performing, and we start realizing how good we actually sound, we start getting into our head and start thinking, all right, come on, don't mess it up. Don't mess it up. And without realizing it, we just interrupt the flow. We start demanding ourselves to keep sounding good. And guess what? That's when something bad usually happens, isn't it? So in other words, to be a master, we need to be able to access the space at will. And we need to be able to play and to perform from the space, to practice from the space, to compose and teach from the space, and even to listen from the space when your ego is not interrupting your listening. Kenny Werner says, a true master is not just a master of technique or language, but of himself. And Kenny also suggests for the reader to use meditation as a tool to achieve this state. We're going to have a whole other conversations about meditations in the future video. But for now, if you want to get into the space, try to surrender the need to sound good and try meditation. But be careful. Kenny Werner also warns against using substance to achieve the states of flow, because again, you have to be a master of yourself instead of letting the substance to rule over you. When we are talking about the space, Kenny Werner actually dedicates an entire chapter to the subject. But patience, this is kind of my personal takeaway, because I think when you embark on the journey to achieve mastery, the one obvious ingredient is time. We all know that Rome is not built in a day, but we expect ourselves to be a master in one day. Going back to the fear-based practicing, when we rush ourselves through materials, that's because we worry that, we would die before we can really play? So I think it's important for us to cultivate patience in this whole deal, because having patience when you're practicing will allow you to fully concentrate, to fully engulf in the materials without worrying if you will ever be a master. Let's see what happens when you have patience. You have the sense of detachment. You are detached from your ego, right? And what happens when you detach from your ego? That's when you get into the flow, into the zone, into the space. Eventually, it's all tied together. Having patience allows us to get into the space, and in the space, we will find love, compassion toward ourselves, which is the powerful antidote to all the irrational fear that bog us down. I love this one quote from Kenny Werner. It eloquently says, "In fear we expect, with love we accept." So that's it, guys. That's the Effortless Mastery. I really encourage every artist from all disciplines to grab a copy of this book. The principles in this book really applies to life in general. You can practically apply all the principles to master just about anything matters in your life. I think this book is just so incredibly universal, despite being written by and for musicians in particular. If you want me to do more of this book review, please let me know in the comment below. Go ahead and give me some book suggestions, and I'm always looking for books that I can help me in my journey as a musician as well as a human being as a whole. And if you're a music nerd like myself, go ahead and check out some of my weird music experiments as well as some musical adventures that I have been embarked on. And make sure to smash the like button, subscribe to this channel, and hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when I upload the next video. Thank you so much, guys, for hanging out with me today. I'll see you in the next video.